Some people think that because stories are all about personal taste and opinion, that therefore there is no such thing as a bad story. Trust me, this isn't true. The reality is that many self proclaimed writers, most of which haven't actually had a book published, make the same mistake. They're writing for themselves, not for readers. If you're one of those writers, there's nothing wrong with thinking that there's no such thing as a bad story, so long as you don't want people reading your story and, by extension, aren't planning on getting your book published. If, however, you want your story to be acquired by an editor or literary agent, you've got to think about readers, and that's where the difference lies. There is definitely such thing as a bad or a bland manuscript when you're considering readers. Here I'm going to teach you how to recognize a poorly or blandly constructed story. This can help you in your literary consumption, in your own writing, and in editing other people's work. I'm going to go over 3 principles of each. 3 principles of bland writing, 3 principles of bad writing. As a precursor, let me start out by saying that storytelling is made up of 2 major components. What the story is, that is the events in the story and the decisions that the characters make, and how the story is told, that is the words, phrases, grammar, etc. that the author uses. In this section, we will be focusing on the first aspect of storytelling, the mechanics of how the events in a story work together, rather than the writing mechanics of good grammar, engaging words, etc. Let's start off by studying a poorly or badly written manuscript or story. The first element of a badly written story is that it is confusing. When a story is confusing, this means that the reasons that events occur and that characters make decisions are either unclear or they're just not given. It's important to note that this does not mean that mystery is unallowable. In fact, discovering the motive for a character's mysterious decision or trying to find the reason behind a mysterious event can make for engaging writing. However, some authors mix up confusing and mysterious writing. Here's the difference. Mysterious writing ends and confusing writing begins where A. the lack of reason for an unestablished decision or event is not addressed within the text, or B. the reason behind an unestablished decision or event is never even given. When you have an event happen that is confusing and that the reason is never given within the text, characters accept it without question and move on. This is the same as the writer expecting the reader to just accept it without question and move on as well. And when the unestablished decision or event is never given a reason, the reader has to wonder what happened and why it happened. If your reader is left wondering why things have happened, then you've failed on some level as a writer. So, that's confusing writing. Let's move on to the second element of bad writing, which is inconsistent writing. When a story is inconsistent, this means that the established rules of a universe are broken, or a character's decisions contradict their established personality. Inconsistent writing is very similar to confusing writing in that they both have to do with the reasons behind actions and decisions. But whereas confusing writing means we are not given reason, inconsistent writing means that the reason we are given contradicts established rules. Inconsistent writing can be tricky when editing, because lots of times it is on either side of the spectrum of extremity. Sometimes it can be fixed by correcting a single sentence or a single word, like fixing a date or some other small detail. But lots of times entire plot points hinge on a single inconsistency. It happens all the time. Now that we've discussed the first 2 elements of bad writing, confusing and inconsistent writing, we're going to talk about their daddy. This third element is usually the guilty culprit behind why a manuscript is confusing or why it's inconsistent, and that is contrived writing. Now, to be contrived means to be forced. When a story is contrived, this means that the events, dialogue, and messages that the author wants to be in the story just don't have a good enough reason to be there. While it is true that a story can be confusing or inconsistent without being contrived, and a story can be contrived without being confusing or inconsistent, the truth is that these almost always go hand in hand. Sequence of events rely on coincidences, characters make decisions that are against their established personalities, and also just happen to move the plot forward, etc. Now, why do authors do this? Why is there such a thing as contrived writing? Why do they force certain elements into a story? Well, there's usually 3 reasons. The first reason is that they're trying to add drama, suspense, or other engaging elements. The second reason is that they're trying to force the story in ways that they want it to fit. They've had these certain ideas for things that go on in the story in their mind, but they haven't really plotted out good enough reasons for those events to happen, so they shoehorn them in there. Or thirdly, they're trying to deliver a message. Lots of times it's going to be some moral or political issue that kind of goes against the themes of what we've already been given. Now, I'm going to give you an example of contrived writing that we can all identify. Have you ever seen old spy movies? Usually, we're introduced to a villain who's established as being hyper-intelligent and greatly efficient. When at the end of the story, however, they have the hero within their control, rather than just killing the hero and getting on with their evil plan, they put the hero in some sort of elaborate killing machine or trap or torture machine before they just leave the hero alone for a couple of hours. I mean, this allows the hero sufficient time to escape and foil the villain's plans. Though we have been told, and perhaps even shown throughout the entire movie, that up until this point the villain is intelligent, he's cunning, he's very efficient, this course of action is pretty stupid. It gives his enemy huge and ample opportunities to dismantle his entire plan, when he could have just, with a simple bullet, solved the problem immediately. We all recognize this and we all make fun of it, but this is a prime example of contrived writing. The writer wanted scenes in there. He wanted this moment of tension. He wanted the trap in there. And in so doing, completely ignored the established personality of this villain. This breaks our suspension of disbelief, and it is bad storytelling. We recognize it, we make fun of it, and yet this happens all the time in books that are published. Maybe it's not as dramatic an example, but if you ever have a character or a villain doing something that they have never done before, just so the hero can escape, that is an example of contrived writing. So those are 3 elements of bad writing, but let's move on to bland writing. Is a bland story better than a bad one? Yeah, of course. But would you want someone calling your work bland or boring? I wouldn't. After all, don't we read in order to be stimulated? For that reason, it can be just as important to recognize bland writing as it is to recognize bad writing. Like bad writing, we can identify 3 elements of a bland manuscript, story, movie, whatever, and they're as follows. The first one is that a bland manuscript is cliché. A cliché plot is basically a plot that we've seen over and over again. A prime example of a cliché plot for our day would be a young person who doesn't feel like they fit in finds that they have extraordinary powers and must fight evil. How many books, movies, and TV shows tell that story? Harry Potter, Star Wars, Superman, Spider-Man, the list goes on. And this happens a lot in the publishing industry. Some book gets very popular and makes a lot of money, and then lots of other people follow suit. After Twilight came out, how many teenage paranormal romance novels started hitting the shelves? An absolute butt-ton. After the Marvel Cinematic Universe proved to be successful, how many superhero movies did we start becoming subjected to? It's the same principle. Someone makes something that's successful and people follow suit, and that's when you have something original that almost gets degraded into a cliché over time. Of course, it's not just plots that can be victims of clichédom. Characters run this danger too. You can identify cliched characters because they are one-dimensional stock characters with no complexity. They're nothing more than their roles. They're the teacher, the villain, the comic relief. And when we are only seeing one dimension of these characters and their existence never goes beyond the role they fulfill in their story, you can tell that they're cliched. So that's the first principle, but a step above cliched writing is undetailed writing. In all fairness, it can sometimes be difficult to write an undetailed plot. Most writers don't have a problem with this. I'm sure some have succeeded, don't get me wrong, but usually you don't see this as much. Really, where you see the most undetailed writing is in characters. Undetailed characters are those to whom the writer never gives motives. They might be more than just their role they fulfill. In fact, they may make decisions, and those decisions may impact the story, but the reader has no idea why those characters make those decisions. When we ask ourselves, why does the character do what he does, and we have to answer with, he just does, we have an undetailed character. It's even possible to have original characters that are still undetailed. It's when, like with stock characters, we only ever see one dimension of these characters. Of course, every story is going to have some undetailed characters, but the amount of time we spend with a character determines how many details we should know about their motives, for the most part. We probably don't need the life story of a shopkeeper the main character runs into once in order to ask for directions, but when a character that the main character spends lots of time with is never given their own backstory to explain why they make the decisions that they do, there is usually not a whole lot of reason for the reader to become emotionally invested. Now, a story can have an original plot with original characters that have backstories and still be boring. This happens when either the plot or the characters are static. And this is the third element of a bland manuscript. It is static. Now, the word static means stationary or still, not moving. Static writing occurs when plots just don't move forward or when characters just don't undergo any change. Either of these can happen for a lot of reasons. One of the main culprits in stories today is world building. Now, don't get me wrong, good stories need good world building, especially in science fiction and in fantasy novels or movies. But sometimes a world has been dancing around in an author's head for so long that they have all these details that they want to include in their story that aren't always super pertinent. You can do this a little bit in order to help submerge the reader in the experience, but when you start explaining a world so much that the characters don't actually experience, then you run the risk of boring writing, which honestly can be detrimental. The reason being is because when people who aren't required to read the book, like students or editors or your family who said they'd read your story, there's nothing to stop them from just putting it down and never coming back. You need to keep your reader engaged. That doesn't mean you always need to have something actiony going on, but you always need something interesting. And too much world building can overthrow that balance towards the boring. Now, it's not just plots that can remain static, it can also happen to characters. You might have heard the term a flat character. What that basically means is that a character just doesn't undergo any changes throughout the course of the story. Generally speaking, the amount and level of difficulty of the trials a character undergoes should be an indicator of how much that character changes. For example, if a character has their parents get killed, they have to perform some magic ceremony that's going to save the world, and they have to see loved ones die, and they come out at the very end of the story not changed, one, it's unrealistic. Two, it's boring. People change, especially with events of that magnitude. I'll give you an example. Ariel from Disney's The Little Mermaid. She starts out as a naive character who knows what she wants but doesn't quite understand the world around her. Then she goes through an amazing series of events, and at the end of the movie, she hasn't actually changed. She gets what she wants. She doesn't learn a lesson. She doesn't become more world-wise. Her fantasy gets fulfilled, but she doesn't grow as a person. That's what we would call a static character, and lots of times it can make for boring writing. Now that you know how to identify some aspects of both bad and bland writing, get out there. Read, write. Now you know how to make a better story and what makes a story better. Thank you.